series that we began in the memory of Dr. Ashok 2 years ago. We intend to hold a lecture every year under this series, and our aim has been to invite a stalwart from his or her own field within the broad field of culture. The sort of essential aim has been, given that we lost Dr. Ranade very, very early, I mean, there was a lot that he expected, and there was a lot in process that he was involved in. And our whole effort has been, in some sense, to gather a certain community around which, in their own way, is related to the kind of work that he was doing. So our idea is to get people to actually talk about their work and, in one sense, sort of propagate and carry forward what Dr. Ranade was doing and perhaps would have been involved in had he stayed on. The first lecture that we organized was in 2012, and that was by Dr. Sandeep Bhagwati. He is the avant-garde, well-known composer based in Canada and professor of electronic music. His topic was softwares and songs, where he talked about how new kinds of global musicking emerges from new ideas and new instruments. It was a fitting start to this series and attended sort of very widely, and there was a lot of vigorous participation and interaction with the audience, and we did believe that it was a very suitable beginning to this series. Last year we invited another stalwart from his field, Dr. Naresh Fernandes, who is of course the well-known cultural commentator and critic, and perhaps India's foremost authority on the subject of linguistics. His topic was Towards an Indian Aesthetic, where he talked about the challenges that we as Indians face, having inherited two sort of twin legacies, cultural legacies. One, of course, our own native one, and the other because of our colonial heritage. And the way in which one can perhaps reconcile and, in fact, even vigorously synergize them. That again was a talk of a very, very high caliber, and both these talks will be available on YouTube. Dr. Ganesh Davis is already uploaded on YouTube, and the other one is just in the process of being sort of edited, and there was some problem with the sound, so we are going to put that up also.
Namaskar and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Most of you are perhaps familiar with Dr. Ashok Ranade's contribution to culture in India, and so my introduction may seem unnecessary. And yet on every occasion that we discuss music, one cannot but remember and learn from the body of work he has left behind. By music, I mean every kind of music, as Dr. Ranade was against any hierarchies between systems and forms of music. Although he was trained in the Hindustani tradition under stalwarts like Gajanan Bua Joshi, Lakshman Rao Bodas, Prahlad Gun, and Professor B.R. Devdar, his eclectic approach shone brightly in his scholarly writings on all categories of music. His deep and awe-inspiring erudition had an effervescent quality fueled by his perpetual, almost childlike curiosity about anything to do with music, be it film songs, background music, jingles, signature tunes for broadcasting and telecasting, version music and remixes, political songs, doorbells, melodic motor horns, lobby music, and more. Dr. Ranade's proclivity for codification, categorization, and definition has given us a vocabulary that has become integral to the discourse on Indian music. His ability to make connections between seemingly unrelated historical events and musical occurrences stemmed from his conviction that the evolution of musical ideas was influenced by a variety of circumstances such as geographical contiguity, religious connections, political subservience, migration, trade, and increasing interest in other performing cultures. He believed that such confluences led to the formation of cultural zones, which more than political boundaries formed contiguous areas of musical practices. As a teacher, he ensured that his knowledge was freely available to students. As the first director of the University Music Center at Bombay University, he brought together elements of the Guru Shishya tradition and modern institutionalized education. Dr. Ranade's compositions for Khayal, Lavani, Bhajan and other forms, and his theatre and film work bore his stamp of individuality. Incisive and precise, analytical and informative, witty and thought-provoking, Dr. Ranade was a master at making the most complex of concepts sound simple and tangible through his lectures. Today, artists, scholars and audiences miss him, but his legacy lives through his music, his books, his lectures and more.
So this lecture is titled, How Jazz Became an Indian Music. On the evening of Sunday, February the 12th, 1978, a group of enthusiastic fans filed into the Rang Bhavan amphitheatre in Bombay's Dobi Talab neighbourhood for the inauguration of a music event of the sort the city had never witnessed before. In the tiny classified ads that had appeared in the Times of India in the previous fortnight, the organizers had promised 7 days of mind-blowing music by the greatest musicians in the world. Geeta Mehta, the writer from New York, was at Rang Bhavan looking for material for a book that she would later title Karma Kola, and she seemed rather amused by everything she witnessed. The auditorium was ringed on 3 sides by the grey stone neo-Gothic buildings of educational institutions such as St. Xavier's College, which had been constructed at a time, she would later write, when dreaming spires and higher learning were more or less synonymous in the British mind. India, on the other hand, was represented in the flora and the fauna. Large banyan trees broke through the cultural pretensions, leaves obscured by tattered kites, roots overrun by Bombay rats scurrying in and out of the event, she would later write. But despite the rodents and the odorous toilets, which also caught her attention, the ambition of the event was unmistakable. It was called the Jazz Yatra, the journey of jazz, and an unmistakable indication of the path it intended to take was to be found on the cover of the rather smudgy program. A tagline described the Yatra as a festival of Indo-Afro-American music. Over the next 3 decades, the festival would, at 2-year intervals, bring some of the biggest jazz names in the world to India. The legends would include Max Roach, who in the 1950s had revolutionized the way the drum kit was played, transforming the drummer from being a mere timekeeper into an instrumentalist as vital and as creative as any other in the ensemble. There would be the saxophonist Stan Getz, whose wispy tone was instantly recognizable, especially when he played his most famous hit, The Girl from Ipanema, which was the result of an innovative collaboration with some of Brazil's most innovative musicians in the 1960s. The violinist Stefan Grappelli would put a smile on everybody's face with his warm, infectious tone, recalling the time he and the gypsy guitar player Django Reinhardt had given jazz a deliciously French twist at the Hot Club of France in the 1930s. A taste of the pleasures to come over the next 30 years was available at that first edition of the festival. On the bill was the trumpet player Clark Terry, whose liquid golden tone would influence 2 generations of horn players, and Sonny Rollins, whose free-swinging, unaccompanied improvisations had forced musicians to rethink the very structures of jazz. But inviting big-name musicians to India was only one part of what the organizers intended to do. They were just as serious in their mission to demonstrate that jazz was actually an Indo-African American music, a form whose development had profoundly been shaped by the sounds of the subcontinent. Of course, if you read any standard jazz history, you'll realize that nobody actually has any quarrel with that idea. All of the books will tell you that starting from the late 1950s, India left a deep impression on several important jazz musicians. Some of those musicians would, in a general way, attempt to infuse jazz with the intensity of Indian spirituality. Others would incorporate into their performances the specific techniques of improvisation they had come to adopt from Indian classical music. Most prominent among them was the meditative saxophone player John Coltrane, whose study of rag-based music under the guidance of sitar player Ravi Shankar in the 1960s had opened up new directions for jazz. In an acknowledgement of his debt to the subcontinent, Coltrane would compose a song called India. He would record an album titled Om and name one of his sons Ravi. Of course, Ravi Shankar and his role as India's most prominent musical proselytizer in the West also finds a mention in most jazz histories. They'll tell you how his performances across the US and Europe and his seminal international recording from 1957, The Sounds of India, released on Columbia Records, brought new ideas to performers across a range of genres. Western classical musicians like Philip Glass, pop musicians like George Harrison, as well as several jazz composers. But like so many other narratives in circulation, these accounts foreground the experiments and strategies that had gained currency in the West and accords credit for them to Western musicians. That's an impression that the organizers of the Jazz Yatra were hoping to correct. Over the 30 years that the festival lasted, the organizers, most notably the passionate Mumbai impresario Niranjan Javeri, would attempt to remind the world of the very deep roots that jazz had sunk in India and attempt to bring to attention some of the fruit and the flowers that the tree of Indian jazz had produced. And so, to indicate the general terrain that they hoped the Jazz Yatra would explore, the honor of giving the very first performance of the festival was accorded to an aging Parsi man with a glossy sheen of brill cream in his hair. He shuffled onto stage that slightly chilly Sunday evening in 1978, presumably having dodged the rats, to blow out these notes from his gleaming saxophone. Okay, so that wasn't exactly a virtuoso performance by any stretch of the imagination. But to people who had been following his career and the development of jazz in India, that rendition of Rag Soni sent shivers up their spines. Rudy Cotton had been playing jazz in an Indian way long before John Coltrane met Ravi Shankar. In fact, Rudy Cotton had been playing jazz for longer than most of those American legends at that edition of the Yatra. That isn't really surprising. Jazz, after all, was the world's first pop. As most of you know, jazz was born in the first decades of the 20th century in the melting pot city of New Orleans in America, when the bluesy African-derived field songs and polyrhythmic drummings of slaves working in the cotton fields in the American South mashed up with the sophisticated harmonies of European classical music. All this was rounded off with what we now call the Spanish tinge, the Latin melodies and rhythms of the Iberian colonies in the Caribbean. Jazz was a great sponge, predicated on an open-mindedness that allowed it to absorb into itself any sound that was considered interesting or pleasurable. A happy technological development ensured that jazz made its way to the furthest corners of the planet very quickly. Jazz was born at broadly the same time as cheap gramophones became available around the world. And the new music from America traveled across the oceans in the cargo holds and passenger cabins of steamships. The first mention I could find of the word jazz in the Times of India was in April 1919. And to be honest, the rather starchy paper of record was not impressed. After all, this was an era before the Times of India had begun to organize literature festivals with dodgy guests. Here's what the paper had to say. London appears to have been taken by jazz bands and jazz dances, and the clergy are denouncing the dance as indecent, immoral, and degenerate. It's a little bit like the Times of India Lit Fest. The Times report was based on an interview with Ross Sobel, the bandmaster of the Maharaja of Cooch Behar, who had recently returned from the British capital. He confessed to the Times that he found the jazz craze quite inexplicable. But from its very infancy, Indians have had pretty strong ideas about how to improve the music. Working in the New York Public Library a few years ago, I came across a report of a lecture given in Buffalo, New York in 1922 by a man named Harendranath Maitra, who was described as one of India's leading scholars, musicians, and journalists. After the lecture, he was asked for his opinion on American music. American jazz music, Maitra sneered, that is not music. It lacks rhythm and expression. And he predicted, I think it will not last long. But Maitra had a solution. America should blend some of the finer Hindu tones to enrich its music. Jazz, he said, had one redeeming quality. It is lively. Indian music, of course, was far superior. It is really nature's song to her beloved, he said. Enumerating its virtues, Maitra explained, Indian music moves in a soft flowing rhythm. More and more you get into its swing, you will feel poise, balance, and harmony you have never felt before. His recommendation was that American composers should strive to create a similar atmosphere around their compositions. Of course, the impulse to snatch and grab the best bits from diverse, seemingly unlikely traditions has long characterized Indian performance. From the middle of the 19th century, for instance, the dominant form of organized entertainment in urban India was a vibrant genre of Hindustani Urdu musical drama known as Parsi theatre. It got its name because of the fact that the large touring companies that took this form around the subcontinent were owned by Parsis, even though the performers were drawn from many different religious groups and nationalities. These troops would do anything it took to put on a good show. As the scholar Catherine Hansen notes, Parsi theatre created the first pan-Indian theatrical form by blending certain European practices of stagecraft and commercial organization with Indic, Persian, and English stories, poetry, and music. Among the people who best exemplified this adventurous spirit was this man. Sort of a grainy picture of him. His name was Kavaschi Palanji Khattar, and he came to prominence as an actor in the Empress Victoria Theatrical Company in the early years of the 20th century. He gained great prominence for his role as Hamlet and for his strong singing voice, and he soon graduated to writing dramas himself. He's credited with turning Ali Baba and his 40 Thieves into an Urdu opera. He eventually passed on this flair for performance to at least one of his grandchildren, a boy who would also inherit his grandfather's name. But Kavaschi Khattar didn't sound glamorous enough for somebody who wanted to make his living as a jazz musician, so he changed his name to Rudy Cotton. We know that Rudy was interested in jazz from at least 1935, when the elite residents of his home city of Bombay were driven into a tizzy by the goings-on at the Taj Mahal Hotel, which was the epicenter of social life for the city's affluent. That winter, after a decade of listening to the sounds of New Orleans on records and being performed by local bands, India was finally going to have the opportunity to listen to its first all African-American band, or to use the very racist phraseology of the time, its first all-Negro band. It was led by Leon Abbey, a violinist from Minnesota. And though they played at a quicksilver tempo that Bombay dancers found quite impossible to keep up with, they were a great hit. For young Indian musicians especially, who had previously learned how to play this new music by listening to records and by reading of scores, this was a chance to learn from the masters. One of the musicians in Leon Abbey's band, the horn player Bill Coleman, left a detailed account of his time in India and in other parts of the world in a memoir titled Trumpet Story. It's filled with details of what the musicians ate, their accommodations. Evidently there were lizards everywhere, even in the Taj, and the quirks of the clients at the Taj. He also writes about a young musician named Rudy, who was captivated by the smooth tenor saxophone of Coleman's bandmate, the saxophone player Cass McCord. Coleman wrote, he and his buddy used to come to the hotel in the afternoon after we had lunch and ask us questions about jazz musicians and the music they had heard about. By 1940, Rudy Cotton had put together his own band and was spending a lot of time on the road, playing in Delhi and Simla. Summer often found them at Hackman's Hotel in Mussoorie, playing swing-tinged dance music in his unique style. Among the dancers on the floor on Hackman's in the summer of 1947 was this young British soldier who would go on to make his living as a jazz drummer when he returned to England. Roy Halladay is now 90. He still plays, and Rudy left such an impression on him. He occasionally sends me Facebook messages about Rudy Cotton's music. Just last month, Roy wrote to me saying, "Hello Naresh, can you help me please? Just prior to partition, there was some consternation as to whether or not Western dance music might or not be acceptable. Rudy Cotton had arranged and transcribed some traditional Indian melodies to be played as rumbas. Do you know if any of these were ever recorded commercially? Many thanks and very kind regards, Roy." As it turns out, this recording from the Jazz Yatra is the only real evidence we have of what Rudy Cotton sounded like. But we know from Roy Halladay and from many others at that time that Rudy had been trying to play jazz in an Indian way for a very long time. He wasn't the only one. Another acquaintance I made on the internet was a man who also lives in the UK named Percy Khattar. He's Rudy Cotton's son. And he sent me this picture of his father and a couple of musician friends when they were touring Rangoon in 1939. If we ever needed evidence of just how significantly our lives can be shaped by the friends we have when we're young, it's visible in this picture. Each of the men in this picture was passionate about jazz and admired the freedom that they thought the music represented. They wanted nothing more than to become skilled enough at their instruments to play with complete abandon, to play, as they said, to play like Negroes, to play like African Americans. Each of these men also shared something else. They would all change their names, and each of them would construct important signposts indicating possible paths that jazz could take on its journey in India. The man to the right was born Franklin Fernandes in Goa in 1920. And like so many members of his community, he loved music. He started playing in his church orchestra and developed his talent by playing in the village marching band. As a teenager, he heard records by American jazz musicians, and that, he said, changed his life. Jazz, he said, gave him freedom of expression. He told me when I interviewed him many years later, like Indian music, jazz can't be written. You have to feel it. There are 12 bars, but each musician plays it differently. You play as you feel. Morning you play different, evening you play different. Franklin Fernandes grew so enamored of the new music from America that in 1936, at the age of 16, he decided to make his living as a trumpet player. He headed to Bombay, where like so many other Goans, he hoped to find work in one of the city's famous dance orchestras. And of course, that wasn't easy. Competition for work was quite intense. So he began to work at the Bata Shoe Company in Mazagon for 12 annas a day. But after work, he would perform at amateur nights that were held at Green's Hotel, which is now where the new Taj Mahal is. And he hoped to attract the attention of somebody who mattered. He got his first big break in 1941 when he was hired to play at the Taj in the band of Teddy Weatherford, who was a famous African-American pianist who had spent his childhood working in the coal mines of Virginia. He had been in India since 1936. Playing with Weatherford really helped. The important thing I forgot to tell you was that as he joined Teddy Weatherford's band, he decided that Fernandes was not a cool enough name, and he changed his name to Frank Fernand. I have strong views on the matter. I think Fernandes is a cool enough name. After playing and learning from Teddy Weatherford, he joined Rudy Cotton's band, and by the mid-40s, he was playing at Hackman's hotel in the hill station of Mussoorie every summer. And that's where he was in 1946, when the Congress Party and the Muslim League reached a deadlock in their negotiations with the British cabinet mission held by Sir Stafford Cripps about the modalities of Indian independence. As talks ground to a halt in Simla, Mahatma Gandhi headed for Mussoorie on May the 28th, 1946. At a prayer meeting on May the 31st, a few days later, Gandhi described the problems faced by India's untouchables before moving on to discussing the famine that was sweeping the country. He appealed for the rich people to donate every grain of food they could find to poor people. The only solution to India's hunger problem, Gandhi said, was in self-help and cooperation among all, and the removal of corruption that had resulted in profiteering on the black market. As it turned out, Frank Fernand was in the audience, and that speech transformed his life. He told me, Gandhi completely changed my ideas. Shortly after the speech, he read Discovery of India, and the book prompted him to rethink the relationship between art and society. He grew determined to give jazz a uniquely Indian expression. And this took some work because Fernand, after all, had been trained in Goa in the Western classical tradition. And Hindustani music was pretty alien to him. So he began to seek out Hindustani musicians and realized that their approach to their art helped him enhance his jazz playing. I was fascinated by the rhythm, he told me. It was far in advance of the jazz I was playing. The encounter with Gandhi also transformed Fernand and turned him into a bit of an activist. In January 1947, he was at the forefront of the effort to start a trade union called the Federation of Musicians India, which aimed to organize and unite the persons engaged in the profession of Occidental music throughout India and to regulate their relations with their employers. As my friend Roy Holiday from the UK noted, the 1940s were an uncertain time to be a jazz musician in India. They weren't certain whether the new India would have a place for them. Fernand laid out some of these anxieties in a newsletter for the Musicians Federation. What of prohibition, he wrote? Will the purists proscribe the habit of Western dancing? Will all those elements in India who are not yet part of the Indian Union be regarded as foreigners? This last question must have weighed quite heavily on the minds of the Federation's largely Goan membership, because Goa, their home territory, was still a Portuguese territory and would be a Portuguese colony until 1961. But despite these fears, Fernand was among the musicians on stage at the ballroom of the Taj on the midnight of August the 14th, 1947. All of Bombay's smart sets were there too. There was the industrialist J.R.D. Tata, the mayor of Bombay, A.P. Sabawala, whose son would become the painter Jahangir Sabawala, the irascible journalist Dosu Karaka, and Nehru's sister, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit. As midnight struck, the ships in the harbour sounded their sirens, and the crowds that had been milling at the gateway of India all surged into the Taj. On stage, the jazz musicians launched into a jaunty version of the national song, Jana Gana Mana. The journalist Dosu Karaka later described the scene in one of his books. Happy chaos descended, he recalled. Men in dinner jackets danced with men in dhotis. Gandhi caps were tossed into the air. Outside, the crowd crooned Jai Hind to the tune of It's a Long Way to Tipperary. So freedom came, like all the New Years rolled into one. Just over a year later, Frank Fernand was back at the Taj with many of the city's best-known jazz musicians. They were celebrating the formation of the Bombay Swing Club, an organization that wanted to present jazz as a serious music, not just as dance music. Here is a program of the event, and I'm not quite sure you can read it. From reports that appeared later, we know that a chap called Frank Oligario received huge applause for his baritone rendition of Old Man River, and that there were a flurry of request tunes in aid of the benevolent fund of the Federation of Musicians. The highlight of the evening, though, which you can see all the way at the top, called Opening Theme, was an original piece by Frank Fernand. It featured a haunting trumpet solo with orchestral accompaniment called Prabhat or Dawn, and it was described on the program as an Indian theme. Fernand's meeting with Gandhi, it seems, had finally borne fruit. But like with so much other music from that period, no recordings were made and we don't know what it sounded like. But as consolation, we do have some recordings that he made later, and I'm going to play a tune he composed for a Konkani film called Amchi Nashi. It's pretty jazzy. It uses Konkani folk tunes and jazz, and I imagine Prabhat was quite different, but this gives you a sense of what Frank Fernand sounded like. The other young man in this photo was born Antonio Xavier Vaz in 1916 in the Goan village of Aldona, and he later changed his name to Chick Chocolate. As a young man, he fell in love with New Orleans jazz, especially the trumpet playing of Louis Armstrong, and he began to style himself on Armstrong, even going so far as to watch his films repeatedly so he could copy Armstrong's mannerisms. In the 1940s and the 1950s, he was performing everywhere. He was at the Taj, he was at the National Sports Club down the road from here, and he was taking turns with his friend Rudy Cotton playing at Hackman's in Missouri in the summer. But by the 1950s, Chick Chocolate had developed a parallel life that gained his music a great deal more popularity than his dance music. Only the listeners didn't know that he was playing it. He, like his friend Frank Fernand, was playing jazz in the nights, but his mornings and afternoons were spent in the Hindi film studios. As it turns out, jazz musicians and other musicians trained in the Western tradition were in great demand by the film industry. That's because of the structural differences between Indian and Western music. That barely needs explaining to an audience as erudite as this one, but let me repeat it anyway. So Indian music is melodic, which means that the main performer plays a single melodic line and everybody else reiterates that line. On screen, this sounds pretty thin, but to effectively convey the drama unfolding on screen, film soundtracks need large orchestras, all playing together to emphasize the urgency of a car chase, to highlight the suspense of an impending murder, or to serenade a sweetly developing romance. They need harmony, with all the musicians of the band or an orchestra playing in related pitches. Now, most of the composers of Hindi film scores, who are known in India as music directors, were trained in the Hindustani tradition. People like Naushad and C. Ramchandra and later Shankar and Jaikishan and dozens of others had a fabulous talent for creating memorable melodies. But to be translated into effective screen music, these melodies needed to be harmonized, to be played by a large orchestra. This is where Chick Chocolate and the jazz musicians came in. Many of them were Goan and had received their musical training in the Western classical tradition, in schools that had been set up by the Portuguese. These Goan musicians were among the few groups in India who knew all about harmony. So the composers of Hindi film music began to hire these musicians as assistants to help them with their scores. This is how the work would proceed. The producer would organize a sitting, something like this as Goans came to call baitaks, and which the composer, who was most often a Hindu, the lyricist, who was often an Urdu-speaking Muslim, and the assistant, who was often Roman Catholic, would flop down on comfortable cushions to listen to the director narrate the plot. When the director indicated a point at which a song was necessary, the composer would hum out a melody or pick it out on his harmonium, and the assistant would transcribe this quickly. And then he would go back to the studio and piece these fragments into an entire song. But he wasn't just taking dictation. He would go back and add the bridges and the introductions, and he would slip in sometimes whatever he felt like. The Goans would sort of draw from their ridiculous bicultural heritage and experience to throw in slivers of Dixieland music, Portuguese fados, a little bit of Duke Ellington, Cha-Cha-Cha, Mozart or Bach. And this is among the things that contributed to giving Bollywood music its promiscuous charm. In addition, the majority of the musicians in most Hindi film orchestras had been members of swing bands. That's because while sitars and flutes and the other Indian instruments were often the lead instruments in the songs, the bulk of the instruments in an orchestra were clarinets and trumpets and violins, instruments that were needed to provide the harmony. For an orchestra to play effectively together, the musicians need to be able to read notation of a score. The musicians who played the Indian instruments weren't able to do this and had to rehearse their parts repeatedly until they memorized them. But the jazz musicians with their Western musical training were all fluent readers of musical scores, which made the recording process much more efficient. Soon, the orchestras in the film studios weren't looking very different from the swing bands that Chick Chocolate played in the evening. This is C. Ramchandra's orchestra, and you can see Chick Chocolate's trumpet sort of protrude out of from the left of the picture. He also worked with Madan Mohan and C. Ramchandra, as I've said, among other people. The music they created was perhaps less ambitious than the experimental music that others were creating, but it really captured the imagination and the spirit of post-independence India. I'm going to leave you with one of the best-known examples of that sound, but before I hit the button on it, I'd like to return to my central thesis, that jazz has such a long history in this country, it's been absorbed into the soundscape, so that when it now appears as an element in an A.R. Rahman soundtrack, or when it's performed by young musicians like Tarun Balani or Sharik Hassan, it doesn't seem unusual or exotic anymore. That's because these three men, Rudy Cotton, Fernand, and Chick Chocolate, though they all had different approaches and strategies, played a vital role in making jazz and Indian music. We may not have had plastic surgery in ancient India like our Pradhan Mantriji claimed. the Heisenberg principle may not have been inspired by the Vedas, but one thing's for sure. Before John Coltrane brought India to jazz, Indian musicians were trying to make a home for jazz in India. As evidence of this, here's a song from Asha in 1957. You all know it. Please feel free to clap your hands or dance in the aisles.
Ina mina dika, dai damenika, maga naga naga, chika pika rika. Ina mina rika dika de dai damenika, maga naga chika pika rola rika. Ram pam poch, ram pam poch.
Thank you.
Naresh, just now I saw that one Indian lady playing that instrument, and in all your photographs I didn't see any ladies playing any. So, I mean, is there any modern people are coming into it? Or?
You know, sort of jazz as a music has always been quite male dominated. Women were always the singers or occasionally the piano players. And in the Bombay bands also, the jazz bands had women singers and women piano players. And in the film industry, there were women piano players. Most notably, there was a woman called Lucila Pacheco who played with Anthony Gonzalez. And her stories actually, which I got from her son, are quite interesting because she faced such sexism, being the only woman among such a large group of men who liked their drink and sort of were given to returning home late in the evening. And as her children said, this didn't lead for an extremely happy home life because her husband was often envious of the situation.
You don't seem to acknowledge the Calcutta contribution.
Aha! The Calcutta question!
Blue Fox and Pan Crane and Brass.
Well, so this sort of ends much before that. But so now you must know that, you know, everywhere you go in India, there are three people who pop up and say, but you forgot Calcutta. And so this is the short answer to this is that, you know, the Calcutta jazz scene lasted into the 70s as a museumized thing. So a lot of people remember that Calcutta scene, the edge of it, and believe that it was the singularly most important thing in India. But Calcutta had a very small jazz scene. That's because I think Bombay was a much more cosmopolitan place. And so there were a great many more people who were listening to this music and dancing to this music. In Calcutta, essentially, it was a small community of Anglo-Indians who were interested in it. A great many of the musicians who played on Park Street were actually Bombay musicians who were going up and down. Also what happened was after the Calcutta scene finished, all those Calcutta musicians, Louis Banks and Pan Crane, came to Bombay. I have often tried to find evidence of this Calcutta thing, looking for programs and recordings. Nobody can seem to find them. So this has led me to conclude that it lives in the memories because it was in the span of living memory. It's been slightly exaggerated. Also, Bombay had the film industry, which employed hundreds of musicians in a way that Calcutta didn't have a similar magnet. So Bombay just had a great many more musicians working here.
So what about Johnny Gomes and Anthony Gonzalez? Were they jazz musicians?
Johnny Gomes was, and I couldn't include everybody in this, but Anthony Gonzalez, as you know, remains one of the great enigmas of the Hindi film industry. He, everybody here knows his name because it appears in the movie Amar Akbar Anthony, but Anthony Gonzalez is actually a real guy. He was he was Pyare Lal's violin teacher. And when the movie got written, Pyare Lal bullied the director into naming one of the characters after his guru. And Anthony was sort of supposed to be one of those genius types. He got his break working with Naushad when he was a teenager and began to do very sophisticated arrangements. He was trained in the Western classical tradition. But he really wanted to be able to symphonize rags. And in the 1950s, he did a series of very ambitious concerts at St. Xavier's College and at Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, where he assembled an orchestra of about 150 players. We have photographs, but we have no recordings, that show banks of sitars and violins, 3 or 4 tabla players, sarods, and Western musicians all playing together. We have descriptions that tell us that the choir began to sing in Konkani, then moved on to Latin, and finally ended in Hindi. But we don't have recordings. In fact, Anish, who is a very close watcher of photographs, was looking at one of these photographs and one day called me up sort of slightly late in the night and said, there is a tape recorder in the front of the stage if you look at it. And I looked at this photograph half a dozen times, it never come to my attention. And sure enough, there's a tape recorder there, but nobody knows what happened to those tapes. So we just have to imagine.
Speak a little bit about the days of cultural diplomacy and how the American jazz musicians were coming here and what kind of interaction they had with Indian musicians.
So this was sort of in the 1950s, as the Cold War got even chillier, the Americans decided that they needed a new strategy to win the hearts and minds of people in Asia and Africa. And so, as the Soviet Union was selling us the Kirov ballet and the Bolshoi, and later a very terrible pop singer called Alla Pugacheva, who some of you may remember, and a chap in leather tights called Valentin Leontiev, the Americans in the 1950s started sending jazz bands around the world. Some of their greatest jazz musicians came to India, and this started in about 1958 with a piano player called Dave Brubeck, who came to India, and these musicians, they made it a mission to send them to not just the metros but off the beaten track. So they appeared in places like Rajkot and Cochin, this was a more leisurely time, so they would stroll around, meet local musicians, talk to them, have jam sessions, and some sort of genuine cultural conversations happened. He, after this, did an album called Impressions of Eurasia, which included a song called Calcutta Blues. A little later, Duke Ellington, the famous band leader, came around, and he similarly sauntered around his musicians, played and jammed with local musicians who still remember these interactions. And he wrote an album, a piece called the Eurasian Suite, that has a song called Bluebird of Delhi, in which a clarinet imitates a mina, and another song called Agra. And so this continued until the Berlin Wall fell, regrettably, or not.
Was there a political objective?
These were organized by the US State Department, some of them, and it was later discovered that some of them were actually organized by the CIA.
And the purpose was?
The purpose was to win hearts and minds. And I think they won because, everybody remembers Dave Brubeck and Duke Ellington with some warmth and Alla Pugacheva with a little disgust.
You talked about mostly the post-independent American scenario of jazz, but there was quite a large section of pre-independent British music influence. So I don't know whether there's any British jazz, anything like that, or...
The British learned to play jazz from the Americans, and the American jazz musicians went to Britain quite early. And so a lot of the African American musicians who came to India would first go to London, then go to Paris, which after the First World War had become a vibrant center for jazz. And then the Taj and other big hotels in Bombay, like Bombay and Calcutta, like the Grand, would book them from Paris. So Paris became the staging point for musicians to travel to India.
And then did they go to Southeast Asia?
Many of them would go to Colombo, Rangoon. Some of them landed up in Singapore. the fascinating thing that I found was that Paris had become this really vibrant center for jazz. Like I said, after the First World War. The First World War was the first time that African American troops were allowed to fight. There was a great deal of there's a racial element to this. White people were very scared of letting black people into war, because if they killed a white person, then this whole notion of racial superiority would crumble. And so the first black troops went only as support staff. And then they began to also be allowed into the battle lines. But when they went to France, they took their music. And this left the French people with a great passion for jazz. And so after the war ended, many African American musicians who had been soldiers went back. Because in France, for the first time, they found that there was no racial segregation. And they were not discriminated against the way they were after they returned to America. There was a sort of paradox to this. They had been shipped off to Europe to fight for freedom, and when they went back to America, they suddenly found that they couldn't vote and faced racial discrimination again. So many of them, a significant number, went back to Paris and started these jazz restaurants. And it was a flourishing scene, and the French took to jazz. But then the Great Depression happened. And in 1934, the French passed what was called the 10% rule, which meant that only 10% of an orchestra could be foreign born. And suddenly all these African Americans in Paris found themselves unemployed, and they had to find new things to do. So they began to spread out to the world looking for jobs. Some of them came to India. A great many of them actually landed in Shanghai, which by 1935 had more jazz musicians than Paris did. And in Shanghai, which was the center of the Chinese film industry, they began to conduct experiments exactly of the sort that Bombay would see 10 years later. So that was another interesting journey that I came across.
Thank you so much for your research. As an Australian jazz musician interested in Indian music, it's been a wonderful education, and I greatly appreciate it. Two questions. Even though there's not recordings, do you know if there are scores in existence from that period?
Not that I've been able to find, and I've put a little effort into this. The recordings are dance band recordings. So, and Suresh sort of goes to Chor Bazaar and digs up many of them, and then he'll call me, and then I will demand that they be digitized immediately, and he will often indulge me. And so now we have about 120 or 130 recordings of Indian jazz or jazz recorded in India. But this was really dance band commercial music. It gives you perhaps a sense of what they sounded like, but we don't really know what the jazz they played was like.
Also, Rock Laird has made a complete list.
And there's a complete discography with about 300 recordings made at that time, maybe even more.
You made reference to there being a dance band in Madras, like very early on, in maybe 1919 or something, very early. Did jazz continue there as well, or was it not?
You know, the astonishing thing about jazz is that, like I said, as popular music, it went everywhere. And it didn't just go to the metropolitan centers. As I put up my website, I've got mail from people around the world, like Roy Holiday, but also other people who told me about their parents playing jazz in Champaran, for instance. You know, and this is because of the cosmopolitanism of the railways. And so a great, a Filipino guy wrote to me to tell me that his father had been a jazz musician in India from about 1935 to about 1947, and that this Filipino family lived in the middle of Bihar in a railway town, and that the father would play at the main railway institute on a Saturday night, and then the rest of the week would go up and down with his band, sort of playing at the smaller places as they went. The cantonment towns were also great centers from which jazz and popular music this sort of went through India. So it was really sort of reached quite remote places.
There were papers that were found at Anthony Gonzalez's place. And
this is the famous legend of the Anthony Gonzalez scores. So Anthony Gonzalez is thought to have, we don't have recordings of that stuff, but his scores perhaps exist. And if you went to see him, he would say, yes, they're there, they're in that trunk, and one day I will open the trunk. And over the years, many people sort of pleaded with him to let them look at the trunk because they wanted to perform this stuff again. And they would call Anthony and say, I'm coming on Wednesday. And he would say, yes, come on Wednesday. Then you landed up on Wednesday and he would say, I told you to come on Tuesday. I cooked lunch for you. And you were not there. And so nobody's actually seen these things. So we don't know whether they're there or they were just some old man's fantasy.
But these were melodies based on rag music.
And the stuff that he performed with his big symphony orchestra, or so we think.
I think there were some musicians who were playing in the silent era
Yes.
of music. Is there that music can be called as jazz, beginning of jazz music? Because there were so many Indian musicians also and many Western musicians also, and there was a blend to be given as a background music for the silent movie.
And I think some of it was improvised, and I think they were sort of taking the most popular music of the day. Though I believe that some, and I don't know very much about this, but some of the music actually came with scores and instructions about what should be played. I sort of interviewed the children of people who had started playing in the silent era, though there wasn't anybody alive by the time I started my research. So I'm not sure what kind of music that would be, though that was sort of in the 20s up to the 30s, and so jazz was still in the process of evolution. So perhaps it was a proto-jazz. I'm not sure how much jazz was there. Peter Lamont. Yeah, no, it's a fabulous, he's really done a great deal of research on that, yeah.